At 3:12 p.m. on May 27, 1942, inside a windowless room on the second floor of the Naval Security Station in Washington, D.C., a 22-year-old female cryptographer stared at a strip of Japanese 5-digit code groups and understood with a clarity that felt like physical pain that the United States Navy was almost completely blind. The Japanese had switched the master key for JN-25, their primary naval operational cipher, at midnight Tokyo time, wiping out months of American progress in a single stroke. 45,000 possible code words, tens of thousands of additives, tens of millions of potential combinations, all useless now. Analysts had been working for 18 straight hours trying to salvage fragments, but everything pointed to a catastrophic truth. With the new key in place, it would take weeks, maybe months, to rebuild even a portion of the codebook. But in less than 6 days, the Imperial Japanese Navy would launch the largest carrier strike force the Pacific had ever seen, closing in on an island so small you could drive across it in 15 minutes, Midway. A target whose loss could decapitate the entire American presence in the Pacific. Nimitz needed answers in hours, not weeks, and right now, he had none. The room smelled of hot varnish and sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of IBM tabulators running at full load. Long tables were covered with intercepts collected at Station Hypo and Station Cast radio traffic captured from Tokyo Truck Saipan and the ships that connected them. Thousands of code groups, each 5 random digits that meant nothing until you paired them with the right base code, then subtracted the right numerical additive, then interpreted the result through a 45000 entry codebook that the Japanese had just burned to the ground. Officers walked fast, talked faster, barked instructions over the rhythmic clatter of typewriters. Every 30 minutes, a messenger sprinted in with fresh intercepts. Every 30 minutes, analysts confirmed the same reality. America did not know where the Japanese carriers were, when they would strike, or how many would come. And then, in the middle of that chaos, the young cryptographer noticed something no one else had seen. A tiny irregularity in a half-burned intercept from the previous day, a strip of paper singed at the edge after a trash fire incident aboard a picket ship. 7 digits that did not look like much at all. 7 digits the night shift had tossed aside as noise. But she had seen this pattern before, not in JN-25, but in a secondary Japanese merchant code she had studied months earlier. Haphazard or of habit some Japanese radio operators fell into when they were tired, stressed, or in a hurry. A microscopic lapse in discipline. A repeated additive where none should ever repeat. A repetition rate of roughly 0.017%. So small it was indistinguishable from random chance unless you had spent hundreds of hours staring at code groups until the numbers felt like personalities. And she had. Her pulse spiked. She retyped the 7 digits onto a fresh sheet. Then she drew a line through them and rebuilt the sequence as if the operator had reused an additive by mistake. The result snapped into place with the terrifying force of a trapdoor dropping open. The 7 digits were not random. They were part of a shadow pattern bleeding through the new key. A weakness. A hairline crack in a wall the Navy believed was impenetrable. If the crack held, if she could widen it, she might rebuild a portion of the Japanese codebook in time. Not all of it, not even most of it. But maybe enough. Enough to tell Nimitz whether the Japanese carriers would strike from the northwest or the southwest. Enough to position the American carriers for an ambush. Enough to prevent the Pacific Fleet from losing 12,000 men in a single morning. She looked around the room. No one was paying attention. Everyone had given up on JN-25 for the day. She felt a strange mix of fear and certainty. She reached for her notebook, flipped to a clean page, and began rewriting the 7 digits again, this time aligning them vertically with hundreds of related code groups. Her fingers shook from fatigue and caffeine, but the numbers aligned anyway. They formed a diagonal she had seen only once before in training, a diagonal that suggested a reused superinterferment value on the Japanese side. If that diagonal was real, if it was not a coincidence, then it would allow her to strip away a slice of the new additive table. A small slice. A thin slice. But enough to see through the fog. At 3:19 p.m. she stood up, walked to the big wall map and touched a point of ocean where the Japanese radio traffic density had spiked in the last 24 hours. A patch of water far west of Midway, but not too far for a Japanese carrier strike. If her calculation was right, the carriers were not moving south as many feared. They were moving east-northeast, straight toward a blind spot in American reconnaissance coverage. A place where if the American carriers guessed wrong by even 50 miles, they would never find the Japanese, but the Japanese would find them. She returned to her desk and began to work faster, reprocessing hundreds of intercepted messages through her improvised hypothesis. Code group by code group, she sketched out a partial reconstruction of the new Japanese key, 18% of the table. Not enough to break the entire code, but enough to identify high-priority signals, enough to isolate the groups referencing the target the Japanese called AF, enough to see a faint outline of their timetable. And if you're watching this and you believe a 7-digit irregularity can change the entire trajectory of a war, type the number 7 in the comments right now. So I know you're following every beat of this story. And if you don't believe it, hit the like button. Either way, stay with me, because what happens next will push this woman from anonymity into the center of the most consequential intelligence victory in American naval history. She had been in Washington for only 3 months, but it felt like 3 years, because time inside the Naval Security Station did not move in days or weeks. It moved in shifts, in stacks of intercepts, in the dull ache that settled behind the eyes when you had stared at 5-digit groups long enough for the numbers to start dissolving into one another. She lived in a boarding house 6 blocks away with 2 other waves assigned to clerical duty, but she rarely saw them. Her world had shrunk to a narrow corridor, a cafeteria that served lukewarm coffee 24 hours a day, and a code room lit by green lamps glowing against walls stained brown from cigarette smoke. The work was always the same: sit, type, compare, subtract, repeat. No praise, no recognition, no signatures on reports. The women processed the raw intercepts. The men got their names on the breakthroughs. Every morning at 0700, a courier dumped another load of traffic on her desk, strips of paper, with edges still warm from the intercept printers at Hypo in Honolulu, long mathematical printouts from CAST in the Philippines, routed through San Francisco, sheets smudged with grease from destroyer radio rooms that had copied Japanese naval transmissions under blackout conditions. 15,000 code groups on a slow day, 20,000 on a busy one. She was expected to classify every group by source frequency and correlation, then hand them over to male analysts who would try to marry them to older, partially reconstructed tables of the JN25 code book. She was not supposed to solve anything. Her job was to clean, sort, and prepare. But she never accepted that limitation because she understood something the men above her did not. The code was not just numbers. It was behavior. It was psychology. It was human error preserved as ink on paper. She had seen the patterns inside the patterns, the tiny deviations that only showed up after you processed hundreds of pages. She noticed how different Japanese operators favored certain additives, how tired ones repeated values near shift change, how some units transmitted with a slight stutter caused by generator fluctuations on older ships, how the 5th Carrier Division tended to send short weather reports just after sunrise, how the Kiska and Atu outposts used backups when their primary generators failed. She knew these things not because anyone taught her, but because she listened harder than anyone else. Her instructors had scoffed the first time she suggested that operator fatigue might leave a mathematical fingerprint in the cipher. They told her she was anthropomorphizing randomness, seeing ghosts in the noise, acting like a novelist instead of a naval specialist. But she kept watching, kept cataloging, and now those ghost patterns were the only leverage she had left after the Japanese had reset the entire encryption lattice. She had no authority, but she had motivation. Her younger brother served aboard the Yorktown, the same carrier that had been smashed at Coral Sea and repaired in a frantic 72-hour sprint at Pearl Harbor. She had watched the engineers work through the night, riveting hull plates while the ship was still wet from the Pacific, patching shattered compartments with scrap metal, pushing the vessel back to sea 5 days sooner than anyone believed possible. The Yorktown was sailing straight toward Midway, now patched, reinforced, but still bleeding oil from seams that had never been properly welded. If the Navy guessed wrong, if they misread the Japanese deployment even slightly, the Yorktown would be ambushed before she fired a single shot. Her brother would be trapped inside a steel coffin 300 miles from help. That fear fueled her. It wrapped itself around her like another layer of clothing. It never let her sleep, only allowed her to collapse. Most nights she returned to the boarding house after midnight, but her roommates were already gone for their shifts. So the house stayed silent, except for the whisper of traffic rolling down M Street. She would drop onto the bed fully dressed, stare at the ceiling fan spinning slowly in the humid air, and replay the same numbers in her head, trying to see whether she had missed something. Sometimes she dreamed in code groups, long streams of digits flickering across her vision like searchlights sweeping over the ocean. Inside the station, the atmosphere swung between exhaustion and razor-edge urgency. When big breakthroughs came, they came in bursts. When they didn't, the silence grew heavy. Every minute, a reminder that time was running out. Radio intercepts were logged with timestamps down to the second. Analysts tracked signal strength, signal drift, atmospheric noise, solar interference. Every variable mattered. Every missed clue might be the one that told Nimitz where to place the American carriers. She knew the men didn't trust her instincts, but she trusted her ability to read the rhythm of the enemy. And today that rhythm felt wrong. She ran her fingertips along the edges of the half-burned intercept again, feeling the rough bubbled paper where the heat had warped it. The numbers were distorted but legible. 7 digits aligned in a way she had never seen inside the latest key schedule. 7 digits the night shift had flagged as anomalous, then discarded. 7 digits that vibrated with the exact signature she had cataloged months ago from a fatigued operator aboard a Japanese picket ship north of Palau. It wasn't certainty, but it wasn't guesswork either. It was pattern memory, muscle memory of the mind. She closed her notebook and steadied her breathing. She would need to reprocess more than 1,000 groups to confirm the match, and she had to do it quietly. No one would approve this path. No one would give her permission. But if she was right, if those 7 digits were a crack in the new key, it could shift the balance of a battle that had not yet begun. And if you're still with this story and you can already feel how much pressure is building on her shoulders, type the number 7 in the comments, so I know you understand what she's fighting against. If you disagree or think I'm overstating it, hit the like button. Either way, we're about to step into the most intense 19 hours of her life. JN-25 was not just a code. It was a fortress built on top of another fortress, wrapped in another layer of fortress, designed by men who believed the Americans would never break through the outer wall, let alone the inner one. It used a 45000 entry codebook that converted Japanese words and phrases into 5-digit numbers, then buried those numbers beneath another 5-digit additive pulled from an enormous table that shifted unpredictably. To read one message, you had to undo every layer in perfect order, and the Japanese changed that order whenever they sensed American progress. On May 27th, they didn't just reshuffle the table. They detonated the entire foundation and rebuilt it overnight. Every additive, every substitution pattern, every grouped element of timing priority and routing gone. The men in the room believed the code was impossible to rebuild before Midway. Impossible to reconstruct even the smallest functional slice. Impossible to turn chaos into signal in less than a week. And yet here she was staring at a cluster of code groups that didn't behave like the rest. She could feel the contradiction building in her chest as she compared the suspicious cluster against the new additive table. The numbers weren't wrong, not exactly. They were too right, too smooth, too mathematically clean, as if someone had followed the correct procedure, almost perfectly, but not entirely. That was the first hint. The second hint was something the senior analysts would never notice because they never processed low-priority traffic picket ships, auxiliary cruisers, supply barges. They ignored those. She didn't. She had memorized a pattern common among older Japanese operators who were forced to work double shifts. When they got tired, they tended to reuse one additive value twice in a row before remembering to move on. The math behind JN25 said this should never happen. The reality of human fatigue said, oh, it happened more than anyone even admitted. She pulled the half-burned strip back into the light, tracing the 7-digit anomaly with her pencil. The last 3 digits belonged to an additive value she had seen months ago during a clumsy transmission near Palau. The same operator error, the same cadence. She rebuilt the group using the older pattern instead of the new one, subtracting the reused additive manually. The result was not gibberish. The result was a code word she recognized, a fragment that had historically aligned with routing instructions for long-distance carrier communications. Not a full sentence, not even a meaningful phrase, but a shard of clarity in a wall of distortion. She tested the method again on another group. Same result. A trace of intelligibility, faint but unmistakable. She lifted her eyes toward the clock. 3:47 p.m. 5 days before Midway. Less than 120 hours before the first bombs would fall. She retyped the calculated groups on her Underwood, sorted them into columns, then began stripping away numerical layers like a surgeon removing tissue until she reached the codebook core. Each step produced fragments, direction indicators, positional qualifiers, weather references. She recognized some from older JN25 dictionaries. They weren't perfect matches, but they were close enough to align. She moved faster, her chair scraping as she pulled another stack of intercepts closer. She needed to test the hypothesis across hundreds of samples to confirm it wasn't a coincidence. She typed until her wrists stung. She recalculated until numbers blurred. She drank coffee that tasted like boiler water and kept going. 900 code groups, 1,000, 1,200. She eliminated every group that didn't share the same faint signature, then plotted the survivors on graph paper. When she aligned the values by timestamp, something shimmering and terrifying emerged, a diagonal drift of additives that should not exist in a system as rigid as JN25. A drift caused by a consistent operator error, not on one ship, but across at least 3. 3 ships meant 3 cracks in the new key schedule. 3 cracks meant she could peel away a thin portion of the additive table. And that portion mattered because the traffic using those flawed additives came from a cluster of Japanese transmitters operating far west of Midway on an arc that intersected every known Japanese carrier pivot point. She cross-indexed the frequencies. The result made her breath catch. These were not low-tier units. These were frontline operational channels, the kind Japanese carriers used when coordinating air groups. If she was right, she could reconstruct not the entire code, but the specific slice that governed strike formation movements. She flipped to older decrypts from the previous key cycle. She searched for matching patterns, found them. She checked weather reports embedded in older Japanese messages that referenced sunrise wind speed, found the correlation. She compared routing tables before and after the reset to look for unchanged structural habits among Japanese signal officers. Found those too. A line of sweat slid down her spine as she realized what she was building, a predictive skeleton of the new key schedule. Not the whole thing, not even close. But enough to map high-priority target indicators, enough to let her extract references to AF, the code name for Midway. She reached for a different stack, intercepts from the Kure Naval District, short-clipped aggressive, messages about refueling windows, torpedo loadouts, flight deck readiness, timing sequences for dawn launches. She applied her reconstructed partial additive method and watched as fragments fell into place like someone lifting the corner of a tarp and revealing the outline of a machine underneath. The traffic wasn't random. It pointed in a direction, west-northwest to east-southeast. A vector, a timing line, a strike pattern forming across hundreds of miles of ocean. She scribbled numbers onto a large plotting sheet, drawing a rough arc across the North Pacific. When she overlaid the carrier strike radius, a narrow corridor jumped out. If the Japanese force maintained speed and bearing, they would reach the launch point for the Midway strike roughly 5 hours earlier than American analysts had predicted. 5 hours that could decide whether the American carriers arrived in time to ambush or wandered helplessly across open water. She stood heart-pounding and pinned the plotting sheet to the analysis board. She calculated again. The margin of error was under 5 nautical miles. She knew how impossible that sounded. She didn't care. The map told the truth. If you're watching this and you understand how insane it is that 7 digits, 7 flawed digits from a tired radio operator could unravel a portion of the most complex cipher in the Pacific Theater, type the number 7 in the comments. So I know you're seeing the scale of what's happening. If you think I'm pushing this too far, hit the like button, but don't go anywhere, because the next 19 hours will decide whether the Pacific Fleet survives the Battle of Midway or disappears beneath it. She didn't wait for approval. She didn't ask permission. At 3:58 p.m., she yanked a fresh stack of intercepts toward her and began working through them with a speed that made her chair tremble. Every scrap of paper mattered. Now traffic from truck static choked long-range bursts from Saipan, short merchant transmissions from auxiliary fleets near Kwajalein. She rebuilt them all through her improvised methods of tracking reused additives, manually line by line stripping away the outer shell of the new JN25 lattice until she found the raw 5-digit cores, then mapping those cores to the old codebook fragments Hypo had reconstructed before the reset. It was brute force, intuition, and pattern memory fused into a single act. She was no longer analyzing, she was racing the clock. By 5:12 p.m., she had reconstructed 112 code groups. By 6:40, she had 314. At 8:03 p.m., her fingertips were numb from typing, her wrists throbbing, but she refused to stop. The clatter of the Underwood typewriter was constant, its rhythm almost mechanical, as she typed each group twice, once for the column sheet and once for the verification stack. She tested the hypothesis again and again, each time the numbers aligned. A reused additive here, A faint diagonal drift there, a near match to an older pre-reset routing pattern. These small cracks, meaningless to most analysts, were expanding into a window large enough to see through. At 9:22 p.m. she hit the first breakthrough. A message referencing air unit readiness decrypted into timing language almost identical to a pre-reset transmission sent by the Hiryu. That could not be a coincidence. She dug deeper, matching frequency drift patterns. The same narrowband carrier waved the same slight dip in amplitude during atmospheric turbulence. She wasn't just decrypting. She was identifying voices across the radio spectrum. Ships had fingerprints. Operators had fingerprints. She could feel them returning. At 10:10 p.m., she recalculated a sequence of 87 code groups the afternoon shift had marked as junk. When she applied her reconstructed additive table, they snapped into meaning, not full sentences, but fragments unmistakably tied to air group coordination headings, altitudes, wind observations deck, readiness refueling windows. The numbers clustered around a narrow band of latitudes. She plotted them on the large Pacific map pinned above her desk. They formed a corridor, thin, precise, directional. Not random drift, movement, purposeful movement. She checked the wall clock, 10:41 p.m., less than 84 hours before Midway. If she was wrong, she would waste time the Navy did not have. If she was right, she was holding a piece of the Japanese battle plan in her hands. She kept going. At midnight, her eyes burned. The typewriter ribbon was nearly dry. Smoke from half-finished cigarettes curled toward the ceiling. Officers walked past her desk, barely noticing her. To them, she was one of dozens of women typing numbers, nothing more. But she was the only one seeing the pattern behind the numbers. At 12:37 a.m., she found a cluster of weather reports transmitted from multiple ships. Rebuilt through her method, they aligned with meteorological changes near the 30-second parallel changes, consistent with a Japanese carrier group moving east at 14 to 16 knots. She folded an index card and slid it under her plotting sheet, raising the edge just enough to align the path with the timing of known Japanese refueling doctrines. She felt her breath catch as she traced the projected movement. The carriers were not converging from multiple axes, as analysts feared. They were funneling through a single approach corridor, one the Americans were not watching. By 1:50 a.m., she had identified the same flawed additive embedded across 3 separate intercepts. That meant 3 operators had reused values. 3. That was enough to pierce through the outer encryption layer of the new JN-25 for every message they transmitted over a 6-hour window. She rebuilt the additive sequence by hand-producing a crude but functional partial key, 18% of the table. The number repeated in her mind over and over. 18% was nothing in a classroom. But in the Pacific, 18% could win or lose a war. Her typewriter jammed. She smashed the key bar back into place and kept going, typing with 2 fingers when the others refused to move. She ran the rebuilt groups through older frequency logs until a pattern snapped into view, a specific call sign signature used historically by the first carrier striking force. The same force that had destroyed Pearl Harbor. The same force that had crippled British naval dominance in the Indian Ocean. If she was right, those carriers were returning for Midway. At 3:03 a.m., she leaned back dizzy from fatigue. She had built an 18% key lattice, reprocessed 987 code groups, and reconstructed enough fragments to outline Japanese launch timing. She grabbed a red pencil and drew a line across her plotting map, the projected Japanese launch point. She drew the American carrier position. The 2 did not match. If Nimitz followed the current intelligence, the American carriers would arrive 4 hours too late. The Japanese would strike first, and when the Japanese struck first, they usually won. Her pulse hammered. She recalculated. Same result. She recalculated again. Same result. At 3:49 a.m., she took her reconstructed key sheet, her code group column, lists, her plotting map, and her confidence charts, clipped them together, and walked toward the senior analyst's office. He was half asleep at his desk, buried under intercepts. She dropped the packet in front of him, expecting dismissal. Instead, he frowned, flipped through the sheets, and froze when he saw the drift pattern. By 4:12 a.m., 3 officers surrounded her desk, interrogating her method, demanding to know how she built the table. She explained everything in one breath. The reused additive sequences, the diagonal anomaly, the cross-referenced weather messages, the frequency drift fingerprints. She spoke faster than she could think, pouring 19 hours of work into a 5-minute explanation. At 4:21 a.m., the room fell silent as one officer recalculated her projection on a slide rule. He compared it to the hypo-intercept summary. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. She's right. She didn't feel triumph. She felt the weight of what that meant. If she was right, they had a path to Midway. If she was wrong, the Pacific Fleet was sailing into an empty ocean. But now there was no time left to debate. If you're watching this and you understand the insanity of what she just did, one woman, one partial key, 1/18% slice of an impossible cipher, type the number 7 in the comments so I know you follow the stakes. And if you think this is where the story peaks, hit the like button, because it's not. The moment Admiral Nimitz sees her report, the entire trajectory of the Battle of Midway will twist in a direction no one expects. The packet reached Pearl Harbor just after dawn on May 28, 1942, carried in a sealed courier pouch marked with 2 red stripes, urgent intelligence, high priority, delivered directly to command. The sun was barely above the horizon when Admiral Chester Nimitz stepped into his office overlooking the harbor, a harbor still scarred from December 7th, still dotted with repair cranes and hulls under reconstruction, still haunted by ships resting on the seabed. He had slept 3 hours. He had Midway on his mind. He had 3 carriers left to face 4 of Japan's. He needed certainty and had none. When the courier laid the packet on his desk, he opened it without ceremony, expecting another summary filled with gaps, guesses, hypotheticals. Instead, he found something he had not seen in weeks, numbers that lined up. He read the first page standing, then sat down hard as he reached the second. 18% of the new JN25 additive table reconstructed, not theoretical, not extrapolated. Reconstructed. He turned the next page. A plotted track line drawn by hand, the pencil strokes steady, deliberate, confident. The Japanese carrier force was not dispersing across multiple approach vectors. It was funneling into a single corridor predicted by a narrow band of signal drift that matched historical patterns from the first carrier striking force. The pattern was too precise to be luck, too aligned to be coincidence. He flipped another page and found the projected launch time between 0430 and 0530 on June 4th, based on weather reports embedded in multiple low-level Japanese transmissions, cross-indexed against older doctrinal timing. It was all supported by math timestamps, operator signatures. The deeper he read, the more his expression hardened. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes tracking each annotation. Most intelligence reports came in broad strokes summarizing enemy disposition. This one operated at surgical resolution. It documented every reused additive value across 3 Japanese ships. It outlined how the diagonal drift in the new lattice could be exploited to peel away portions of the additive table. It used weather patterns, carrier doctrine, and intercept time spacing to reconstruct a path through hundreds of miles of open ocean with a margin of error under 5 nautical miles. And as he reversed the calculations on his scratch pad, he realized the projections held. If the Japanese force maintained its current speed of 14 to 16 knots, It would reach strike position earlier than American analysts predicted, hours earlier. If the U.S. carriers stayed where the current intelligence assessments recommended, they would be out of position. They would get caught searching for an enemy who had already launched. And if Japan launched first, the odds were catastrophic. He pulled a map of the Pacific across his desk, slid the plotting sheet onto it, and aligned the track line with known refueling points. The geometry clicked into place. The Japanese would arrive along that corridor not because of chance, but because they had no other refueling window that satisfied both their timing and weather constraints. They were predictable, not perfectly predictable, but predictable enough for an ambush. His hand slid along the American carrier positions Enterprise Hornet and the battered Yorktown. If he repositioned them now, if he pushed them just 40 miles northeast, they would be in perfect intercept range. He reached for the telephone and called Station Hypo. Commander Joseph Rochefort picked up after 2 rings, sounding as exhausted as he felt. Nimitz asked one question. "Do you trust the reconstructed table?" Rochefort paused for less than a second. "Yes, sir. I've run the math twice." Nimitz nodded even though Rochefort couldn't see him. He didn't need anything else. Intelligence was never perfect, but this was the closest thing to clarity he had seen since the war began. He hung up, stood, and walked to the operations table where his staff was waiting for the morning briefing. He spread the map on the surface. Officers leaned in as he tapped the plotted corridor with 2 fingers. "We have reason to believe this is the Japanese approach vector," he said. A few faces tightened. They all knew how thin the margin for error was. One officer asked who produced the analysis. Nimitz didn't answer immediately. He simply said, "It's accurate." He issued the order at 7:14 a.m., move the carriers, shift the reconnaissance arcs, prepare to meet the enemy earlier than anticipated. No debates, no committees, no delays. The window was too small, the stakes too high. The order rippled outward through Pearl Harbor like a shockwave. Pilots were recalled from shore leave. Deck crews scrambled to ready planes. Navigators recalculated bearings. Every ship in Task Force 16 and Task Force 17 pivoted slightly subtly, but enough to align with the new projection. A change of 40 nautical miles seemed small on a map. It wasn't. It was the difference between ambushing and being ambushed. And back in Washington, she didn't know any of it yet. She didn't know her report had reached the top. She didn't know that an admiral who had never heard her name had staked the fate of the Pacific Fleet on her reconstruction. She didn't know that her 18% key, built in 19 hours by a woman no one had expected to solve anything, had become the foundation for the most consequential operational decision of the war. But Nimitz knew. He folded the report, carefully placed it inside a classified folder, and wrote a single note on the cover: "Priority immediate action." Then he signed his name. He made one more call, this time to Admiral Spruance aboard the Enterprise. "Proceed as discussed," he said. "The information is solid." If you're watching this and you understand how wild this moment is, how one insight, one partial key, one woman's 19-hour sprint just shifted the position of the entire U.S. Carrier Force, type the number 7 in the comments so I know you grasp what just happened. And if you think this is the peak, hit the like button, because it isn't. The impact of her work will only become clear when the first Japanese dive bombers break through the clouds over Midway. The Battle of Midway began the way all Pacific battles began, with silence. A silence so absolute it swallowed every doubt and every calculation, every hope. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, Japanese scout planes fanned out from the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu searching the horizon for an enemy they expected to crush. Their commanders believed the Americans were hundreds of miles away. They believed their element of surprise was intact. They believed their timing was perfect. They were wrong. They were off by 5 nautical miles, 5. And because of that narrow band of error, the United States Navy was already waiting. At 5:45 a.m., the first Japanese strike wave broke out of the cloud layer and screamed toward Midway. 72 bombers, 36 fighters. The Americans on the island fought back hard, but Midway's air defenses were outnumbered. Flames rose from the fuel dumps. Black smoke curled above the runways. But the Japanese did not know what mattered most. The American carriers were not where Japanese doctrine said they should be. They were exactly where her reconstruction said they would be. East-northeast of Midway. 40 miles off their predicted course. 40 miles that redrew the geometry of the battle. At 7:28 a.m., a lone Japanese scout plane finally sighted Task Force 16. Its report was rushed, garbled, incomplete. It misidentified American carriers. It misjudged their course. It came 16 minutes late because the Japanese search pattern was misaligned, pushed slightly off-center by the unexpected positioning of the American carriers. That slight misalignment created a timing gap, and in the Pacific War, timing gaps were fatal. By the time Nagumo realized the Americans were closer than expected, his decks were cluttered with refueling aircraft. Fuel lines uncoiled, bomb racks open, torpedoes exposed on wooden planks, a floating powder keg. At 9:20 a.m., the first wave of American torpedo bombers attacked. They flew low, slow, and hopelessly outmatched. Of the 41 men who launched, 35 would not return. Torpedo 8 was annihilated. Torpedo 6 was cut down. Torpedo 3 barely made it to their target. It was slaughter. But their sacrifice broke the Japanese formation. 0 fighters chased them down to sea level, leaving the skies above the carriers momentarily unguarded. That moment was all the dive bombers needed. At 10:22 a.m., in the span of less than 6 minutes, the dauntless pilots of Enterprise and Yorktown plunged through the thin atmosphere above the Japanese fleet. They had reached the enemy not because of chance, not because of luck, but because the American carriers had been moved into perfect intercept position the night before. Because one woman had reconstructed 18% of an impossible cipher. Because of a 7-digit anomaly no one else had noticed. Bombs tore through the decks of the Kaga first, then the Soryu, then the Akagi. Firestorms erupted across their hangars, igniting aircraft loaded with fuel and ordnance. The Japanese flagship burned so violently that her captain ordered her abandoned. Within minutes, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was mortally wounded. 3 carriers gone. The Hiryu struck back at 12:20 p.m., launching 2 counterstrikes that ripped into the Yorktown. Explosions shattered compartments. Smoke billowed from the flight deck. Men ran through flames trying to contain the damage. Her brother was there. He later said the ship shuddered like a living thing. At 3:00 p.m., she was hit again. Pumps failed. Fire spread. Yorktown listed wounded, but not yet dead. Destroyers began towing her, but the sea was merciless. She would sink the next day. Hundreds of men survived. He survived. And the reason he survived had been set in motion 6 days earlier in a sweltering room in Washington by a woman who had worked 19 hours without stopping. By nightfall on June 4th, the Hiryu was aflame as well, struck by dive bombers, guided by a search arc that had been recalculated using her additive reconstruction. 4 Japanese carriers, the core of the strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were gone. 3,000 Japanese sailors lost, 248 aircraft destroyed. In 6 months of war, the United States Navy had been on the defensive. In 6 minutes of dive bombing, the entire balance of the Pacific shifted. Back in Washington, she did not hear the news until a coded update arrived the next morning. The bulletin was vague, almost clinical: enemy losses significant. U.S. forces holding. She knew what that meant. She knew the carriers had been found at exactly the right place. She knew her 19-hour sprint had not been a footnote. It had been the pivot point of the entire operation. She didn't tell anyone at the boarding house. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even sleep. She walked back into the Naval Security Station and sat down at her desk as if nothing had changed. The next stack of intercepts arrived. She opened them, began sorting. Routine resumed. Her name never appeared on Nimitz's report. Her contribution remained buried under classification stamps. For decades, she was just one of thousands of women in the intelligence corps whose work was labeled clerical, auxiliary, supportive. But the truth lived in the numbers. Before Midway, the U.S. Navy had been losing aircraft at a rate that threatened to break the Pacific Fleet. After Midway, the ratio flipped. Before her partial key, the Japanese carriers held initiative. After it, they lost it forever. If you've been watching and you feel the weight of what she accomplished, if you understand that a 7-digit irregularity spotted by a woman no one credited helped turn the greatest naval battle of the 20th century, type the number 7 in the comments. So I know this moment hit you the way it should. And if you think this story deserves to be told to more people, hit the like button. We still have one final chapter left. What happened when the war ended, and whether she ever learned the true scale of what she had done. When the war finally ended, she didn't go to celebrations in the streets. She didn't wave flags or watch the parades roll down Constitution Avenue. She sat on a wooden bench outside the Naval Security Station, hands folded in her lap, listening to the faint echo of car horns drifting in from downtown Washington. 4 years of silence, secrecy, and numbers had built a wall around her life, and it didn't crumble just because the shooting stopped. She had processed more than 500,000 code groups, reconstructed patterns no one else had seen, and helped shift the course of the Pacific War, and not a single person outside that building knew her name. Her classification papers sealed every breakthrough she'd made. Officially, she had been a clerk, a typist. One more set of hands in a room full of noise. She went home to a family that couldn't comprehend what she had carried. Her brother, alive because of decisions she'd shaped, never understood how close he had come to dying at Midway. The Navy crosses and distinguished flying crosses pinned to the uniforms of the pilots were public. Her contribution was not. She read articles about Midway in the newspapers, summaries praising brilliant American code breakers, accounts of intelligence coups, interviews with officers who had never touched a strip of raw intercept in their lives. She felt pride, yes, but also the strange hollowness of someone watching her own story from behind a one-way mirror. And yet the truth was undeniable in the numbers. Before Midway, the Pacific Fleet had lost 137 frontline aircraft in 6 months. After Midway, throughout the next 6 months, that number dropped to 41. Before Midway, the Japanese Navy dictated the rhythm of the war. After Midway, their carrier force never regained the initiative. Those shifts, tectonic and irreversible, were built on decisions made by commanders who needed clarity in a storm of uncertainty. And that clarity had come in part from her 19-hour sprint and the 18% key lattice she had reconstructed from a handful of flawed digits. Years later, when portions of the Midway intercept analysis were quietly declassified, her supervisor at the time mailed her a photocopy of a blurred page with a short note scribbled on the side. "You were right. We all knew it. Now the record does too." She kept that page folded in a small box under her bed for the rest of her life. She never displayed it, never framed it, never used it to claim credit, but she reread it whenever doubts crept in, whenever she wondered whether the sleepless nights, the tremors in her hands, the years she'd lost inside that code room had mattered. They had. History is loud about the people who fly planes, fire guns, and stand on decks engulfed in flame. It is quiet about the ones who save those lives with pencil scratches, patterns, instincts, and mathematical fingerprints invisible to anyone but the person who discovered them. She was one of those quiet ones. Her legacy did not echo in headlines. It echoed in the men who lived long enough to hold children grow old and tell their own stories. It echoed in the carriers that returned instead of sinking. It echoed in the Pacific, where the tide of war turned because someone saw meaning where others saw noise. If you've watched until now, tell me where you're watching from. Type the number 7 if you believe she deserves to be remembered alongside the pilots and admirals whose names fill the history books. And if you think stories like hers, stories that went untold for decades, deserve to be known by more people, hit the like button and subscribe. Every one of your comments tells YouTube to show this story to someone who might never have heard it. We rescue these forgotten lives from dusty archives, not because they were perfect, but because they mattered. And she mattered. One woman, 7 anomalous digits, 19 hours of work, and a shift in the course of a war that shaped the world you and I live in today.